Understanding acid-base imbalance is an important part of nursing care. This video will cover pH balance, related lab ranges, and understanding and interpreting abnormal blood gases. We will start by looking at pH. pH is used to measure the amount of acid or base in water. The pH scale ranges from 0 to 14. A pH of 7 is considered neutral. It is neither an acid nor a base. A pH of less than 7 is acidic. More than 7 is basic or alkaline. The pH scale is a logarithmic scale, meaning that a pH of 5 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 6. In humans, the normal pH range is 7.35 to 7.45. This means that humans actually run a little bit basic. If we consider the range from 7.35 to 7.45 to be normal, then a pH of less than 7.35 is abnormally acidic for the human body. A pH of greater than 7.45 is considered to be alkaline. The body has a buffer system that uses a related weak acid and weak base to keep the pH within normal limits. Within this system, the body can resist changes in pH. The weak acid in this system is carbonic acid. However, we can use CO2 or carbon dioxide to represent the acid level in the body. The weak base is bicarbonate, represented by HCO3. While the buffer system works in the blood, the lungs and kidneys can both help to regulate the pH. The lungs help limit acid content in the body by exhaling carbon dioxide. A change in respiratory rate can affect the acid content in the blood. The kidneys can affect the bicarb level in the blood. If carbon dioxide causes a pH change, the condition is respiratory in origin. If bicarbonate is the cause of the pH imbalance, the condition is metabolic in origin. There are two paths that can cause acidosis: respiratory and metabolic. Respiratory acidosis means that the body has an increase in acid or carbon dioxide. Metabolic acidosis means that the body has a reduction in base or bicarbonate. Alkalosis can also be respiratory or metabolic in origin. In respiratory alkalosis, there is a loss of acid. Carbon dioxide levels will be lower than normal. In metabolic alkalosis, there is an abnormal increase in the amount of bicarbonate found in the body. These are the four possible types of acid-base imbalance. There are specific events that can cause each type of imbalance. With respiratory acidosis, there is an accumulation of carbon dioxide because of improper ventilation. Simply, the lungs are unable to adequately blow off the CO2 from the body. The acid builds up and acidosis results. Conditions that cause impaired breathing, like severe COPD or an airway obstruction, can cause respiratory acidosis. The processes that can cause metabolic acidosis are a little more complicated. In shock, the lack of perfusion to the body causes the cells to seek an alternate energy source that does not require oxygen. Anaerobic respiration produces lactic acid. The buffer system in the body will attempt to compensate and the bicarbonate levels will drop. The electrolyte imbalances that result from excessive diarrhea or renal failure can also cause metabolic acidosis. Respiratory alkalosis generally involves a loss of carbon dioxide through the lungs. Hyperventilation due to a panic attack is one example, but more commonly associated with an improper ventilator setting for a patient in the ICU. Metabolic alkalosis can be directly caused by vomiting acid from the stomach. Metabolic alkalosis can also be caused by the electrolyte imbalances caused by dehydration. Acid-base imbalances in the body are identified by taking blood from an artery. These are called arterial blood gases. Let's look at the normal values in an ABG. We already discussed the body's normal pH, 7.35 to 7.45. CO2 is a gas, so it is measured as a partial pressure, 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury. Bicarbonate is measured as a unit of volume concentration, 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. The partial pressure of oxygen is always included in an ABG. This is a very useful metric for a patient on a ventilator or a patient with a respiratory problem. However, PaO2 is not used to determine the acid-base imbalance, so we will ignore it for the remainder of this video. Let's move the normal values up to the corner so we can look at them when we need them. Next, we need to discuss the steps used to identify the acid-base imbalance. The two most important steps are here. We first look at the pH to see if the blood is too acidic or too basic. Then we look at the carbon dioxide and the bicarbonate to see which one is abnormal in such a way that agrees with the pH. Try an example. Here we have a sample set of blood gases. In the first step, we need to look at the pH. 7.20 is lower than the normal range. This means we have acidosis. That takes care of step 1. In step 2, we have to look at the carbon dioxide and the bicarb to see which one is abnormally acidotic. CO2 is elevated, meaning that there is too much acid. Bicarb is normal. Since the CO2 is more acidic, and we know we have acidosis, this condition is respiratory acidosis. Let's do another one. Is our pH acidotic or alkalotic? Since it is low, we again have acidosis. Next, let's look at the CO2 and the bicarb. The CO2 is in normal range. The bicarb is low. Levels of base mean that the bicarb levels are more acidic than they should be. Since the bicarb is more acidic, we have acidosis. Because bicarbonate represents a metabolic dysfunction, we have metabolic acidosis. Okay, we need to add in one more wrinkle. Now that we understand the first two steps, we are going to add a third. The body works very hard to try to keep the pH within normal limits. An abnormal pH can be fatal. The body will use whatever tool is available to try to pull the pH back to normal. So, the body will use the opposite system to compensate. Here, let's take a look. And bring up a new example with the extra step now at the bottom. What's going on with the pH here? It's high, right? So, we have alkalosis. Now, for step 2, we look at the CO2 and the bicarb. CO2 is high, that is too acidic. We have alkalosis going on, so the CO2 does not agree. Bicarb is also high, meaning it is too basic. That does agree with our alkalosis. We have metabolic alkalosis. So, what was up with the CO2? It was too acidic, remember? That is the body trying to compensate for the metabolic alkalosis by using the respiratory system to increase CO2 or acid. Since the pH is still abnormal, the body has not been completely successful in compensating for that abnormal pH. We call that partially compensated. The full phrase that describes the patient's condition is partially compensated metabolic alkalosis. Okay, one more. Let's look at the pH, 7.36. Well, that's normal. What does that mean? Simply, it means the pH is normal. But let's go to step 2 and look at the CO2 and bicarb levels. CO2 is high, and the bicarb is also high. Since the CO2 is high, we have too much acid. With an elevated bicarb, we have too much base. Because they are pulling in opposite directions and the pH is normal, we call this fully compensated. Since the pH is just barely normal on the acidic end of the normal range, it seems likely that the primary problem is respiratory acidosis. However, we can't know if the core problem is respiratory acidosis or metabolic alkalosis without taking a look at the actual patient. We have to see what is going on with them clinically to figure out the rest. Hopefully you have a better understanding of acid-base imbalance now. Let's try a couple of sample questions. The patient is brought to the emergency department after a trauma. The patient is hypotensive with a blood pressure of 65/34 and is determined to be in shock. If this patient had an acid-base imbalance, which type of shock would we expect? Can lead to metabolic acidosis due to lactic acid production. Now we have a set of ABGs. Do you remember the normal ranges? Take a moment to look at these values. Go through the 3 steps. What do we have? The patient's pH is acidotic. The bicarb is also acidotic because it is low. The CO2 is low in trying to compensate. Since the pH is still abnormal, we have partially compensated metabolic acidosis. Thank you for watching.